Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Tonight, we journey to the frozen streets of Fairbanks, Alaska, where in 1997, the brutal murder of a 15-year-old boy led to one of the most controversial cases in the state's history. 4 young Alaska Native men would spend 18 years behind bars for a crime they maintained they didn't commit. No physical evidence tied them to the scene. Questionable interrogation techniques were used, and later another man would confess that he and his friends were the real killers. This is the troubling story of the Fairbanks Four, a case that exposes the flaws in our justice system and raises disturbing questions about who pays the price when the system fails. Let's dive into this chilling miscarriage of justice. On a cold October night in 1997, the streets of Fairbanks, Alaska were largely empty as temperatures dropped below freezing. Most residents were tucked away in their homes, but 15-year-old John Hartman was still out. The teenager was found lying unconscious at the intersection of 9th Avenue and Barnett Street around 2:50 a.m. on October 11th. He had been brutally beaten, his face swollen beyond recognition, his body battered and broken. Emergency responders rushed Hartman to Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, where doctors discovered he had suffered severe blunt force trauma to his head and abdomen. His injuries were catastrophic: a brain hemorrhage, broken ribs, and internal bleeding. Despite the medical team's best efforts, John Hartman died the following day, without ever regaining consciousness. The murder of John Hartman shocked the tight-knit community of Fairbanks. In a city of roughly 30,000 people, violent crime was relatively rare, especially against minors. The Fairbanks Police Department faced immense pressure to solve the case quickly. Within days, they had arrested 4 young men: George Fries, Kevin Pease, Marvin Roberts, and Eugene Vent. All 4 were Alaska natives, between the ages of 17 and 20 at the time. The arrests stemmed from what police described as a night of wilding, a term used to describe random acts of violence committed by groups of young people. According to the police theory, these 4 young men had been driving around Fairbanks, assaulting people at random, when they came across John Hartman walking alone. The evidence that led to their arrests was primarily testimonial. A witness named Arlo Olson claimed he saw the 4 men assaulting another group outside the Eagles Hall, a local gathering place, on the same night Hartman was beaten. Though this was a separate incident from the Hartman murder, police connected the dots and theorized that the same group had attacked Hartman later that night. Another key witness was William Holmes, who was being held at Fairbanks Correctional Center on unrelated charges. Holmes told police that Eugene Vent had confessed to him about the murder while they were both in custody. This jailhouse confession became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Perhaps most damning were the alleged confessions from Eugene Vent and George Fries themselves. Police interrogated Vent for over 11 hours, during which he initially denied any involvement, but eventually made statements that police interpreted as confessions. Similarly, George Fries, after hours of questioning, made statements that prosecutors would later present as admissions of guilt. But there were problems with these confessions from the very beginning. Eugene Vent was just 17 years old when interrogated, and there were serious questions about whether he fully understood his rights. The interrogation tapes revealed that Vent repeatedly denied involvement before changing his story after hours of questioning. He later claimed that he was coerced and confused, telling officers what he thought they wanted to hear just to end the interrogation. As for George Fries, he had sustained a serious head injury earlier that night and was still suffering from its effects during questioning. Medical records would later show that he had been diagnosed with a concussion. His statements were inconsistent and confused, which his defenders would later attribute to his concussed state and the high-pressure interrogation tactics. Despite these issues, all 4 men were charged with Hartman's murder. The trials began in 1999, with each defendant tried separately. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the witness testimonies and alleged confessions, as there was no physical evidence directly linking any of the four to the crime scene. No DNA, fingerprints, or other forensic evidence connected the four men to John Hartman or the location where he was found. None of Hartman's blood was found on their clothing or in the car they allegedly used that night. In fact, the only physical evidence presented was a pair of boots belonging to George Fries, which had what analysts claimed was a spot of blood. However, the testing was inconclusive as to whether it was actually blood, and if it was, whether it belonged to Hartman. The timeline was also problematic. Marvin Roberts had an alibi. He was pulled over for a traffic stop by Officer Aaron Ring at 1:35 a.m., which was documented in police records. The medical examiner estimated that Hartman was attacked between 1:30 and 2:30 a.m., creating a narrow window in which Roberts would have had to participate in the beating, then be pulled over, all without showing any signs of having just committed a violent assault. Despite these inconsistencies, all four men were convicted. George Fries, Eugene Vent, and Kevin Pease received sentences of 77 years, while Marvin Roberts received a sentence of 33 years. The Fairbanks community was divided. Many believed justice had been served, while others, particularly within the Alaska Native community, questioned whether racial bias had influenced the investigation and trials. The four men maintained their innocence from the beginning. From behind prison walls, they began what would become a decades-long fight to clear their names. Their case attracted the attention of the Alaska Innocence Project, which began investigating the convictions in 2008. As the Innocence Project dug deeper into the case, troubling details emerged. Arlo Olson, the witness who claimed to have seen the four men assaulting people outside the Eagles Hall, had been about 550 feet away from the alleged assault, roughly the length of 2 football fields. It was dark, and experts questioned whether he could have accurately identified anyone from that distance. William Holmes, the jailhouse informant who claimed Eugene Vent had confessed to him, later recanted his testimony. In a 2011 affidavit, Holmes admitted that he had lied about Vent's confession in hopes of receiving favorable treatment in his own criminal case. But perhaps the most significant development came in December 2011, when William Holmes, now serving a double life sentence in California for a separate double murder, made a shocking confession. In a sworn statement, Holmes claimed that he and 4 other men had actually been responsible for John Hartman's murder. According to Holmes, he had been driving around Fairbanks with Jason Wallace, Rashawn Brown, and 2 other individuals on the night of October 10, 1997. Holmes stated that they saw Hartman walking alone, and Wallace suggested they fuck with him. Holmes said Wallace, Brown, and another man got out of the car and attacked Hartman while he remained in the vehicle. When they returned, according to Holmes, they were laughing about how badly they had beaten the boy. This confession was particularly credible because Holmes had nothing to gain from it. He was already serving 2 life sentences in California, and making this statement potentially exposed him to additional charges in Alaska. Furthermore, Jason Wallace, one of the men Holmes implicated, had independently confessed to his attorney about his involvement in the Hartman murder years earlier. Wallace's confession came to light in a roundabout way. In 2002, 5 years after the Hartman murder, Wallace was arrested for a different murder. While in custody, he allegedly told his public defender about his involvement in the Hartman case. This confession remained protected by attorney-client privilege until the Innocence Project filed motions to have it released in the interest of justice. The new evidence painted a completely different picture of what happened to John Hartman. According to this alternative theory, Holmes, Wallace, and their companions had been driving a car similar to the one Roberts owned. They were the ones who had committed the Wilding attacks that night, culminating in the fatal assault on Hartman. This theory was supported by the fact that Holmes and Wallace had gone on to commit other violent crimes. Wallace was convicted of killing a woman with an axe and attempting to burn her body, while Holmes was serving time for a double homicide in California. Their violent histories lent credibility to the idea that they, not the Fairbanks Four, were capable of such a brutal attack. The Alaska Innocence Project filed for post-conviction relief in 2013, citing the new evidence. They argued that had the original juries heard Holmes's confession and known about Wallace's statement to his attorney, they would likely have reached different verdicts. The state fought against reopening the case, arguing that the new evidence wasn't reliable and that the original convictions should stand. But public pressure was mounting. The case of the Fairbanks Four had become a rallying point for those concerned about the treatment of Alaska Natives in the criminal justice system. In October 2015, nearly 18 years after John Hartman's murder, a hearing was held to consider the new evidence. For 5 weeks, the court heard testimony from witnesses who hadn't been called during the original trials, experts who questioned the reliability of the confessions, and individuals who supported the alternative theory of the crime. During this hearing, the limitations of the original investigation became increasingly apparent. The Fairbanks Police Department had focused almost exclusively on the 4 young men from the beginning, potentially overlooking other suspects and evidence. The interrogation techniques used, particularly on the young and vulnerable Eugene Vent, were questioned by experts who testified about false confessions. One particularly compelling witness was Dr. Richard Leo, an expert on police interrogations and false confessions. Dr. Leo testified that the methods used to question Vent and Freeze were precisely the kind that can lead to false confessions, especially when used on young people or individuals in a compromised mental state, like Freeze with his concussion. Another significant development was the testimony of Scott Davison, a Fairbanks resident who came forward to say that he had seen a group of people who did not match the description of the Fairbanks Four assaulting someone in the area where Hartman was found around the time of the attack. As the hearing progressed, it became increasingly clear that the original convictions rested on shaky ground. The prosecution's case had been built primarily on questionable confessions and witness statements, with no solid physical evidence. Meanwhile, the alternative theory presented by the defense was supported by confessions from individuals who had demonstrated violent tendencies in other cases. The hearing concluded in November 2015, and everyone awaited the judge's decision. But before the court could rule, something unexpected happened. The state of Alaska offered a deal to the Fairbanks Four. They could be released immediately if they agreed to drop all claims against the state and the city of Fairbanks, including any potential lawsuits for wrongful conviction. It was a difficult choice. Accepting the deal would mean immediate freedom, but also meant they couldn't seek compensation for the nearly 2 decades they had spent behind bars. Rejecting it meant continuing to fight from prison, with no guarantee of eventual exoneration. After much deliberation, George Freeze, Eugene Vent, Marvin Roberts, and Kevin Pease accepted the deal. On December 17, 2015, after more than 18 years in prison, the Fairbanks Four walked free. The agreement explicitly stated that it does not constitute an admission of liability by the state of Alaska or any of its agents. The release of the Fairbanks Four was met with celebration by their supporters, but also raised troubling questions about the justice system. How could 4 men spend 18 years in prison based on such questionable evidence? Why was the state willing to release them, but unwilling to acknowledge that a mistake had been made? For John Hartman's family, the resolution brought mixed emotions. Some family members had long believed in the guilt of the Fairbanks Four and viewed their release as a failure of justice. Others had come to question the original convictions and supported the reopening of the case. The case of the Fairbanks Four highlights several critical issues within the criminal justice system. It raises questions about the reliability of confessions obtained after prolonged interrogations, especially from young or vulnerable individuals. It underscores the dangers of tunnel vision in police investigations, where focus on one theory can lead to overlooking alternative explanations. And it exposes the challenges faced by Indigenous people and other minorities within the justice system. In the years following their release, the Fairbanks Four have worked to rebuild their lives. Marvin Roberts, who had received the shortest sentence and was already on parole at the time of the settlement, continued his education and became an advocate for criminal justice reform. Eugene Vent, who was only 17 when arrested, has struggled with the psychological effects of spending his entire adult life in prison for a crime he maintains he didn't commit. Despite the settlement agreement barring them from suing for compensation, the men later filed a civil rights lawsuit against the city of Fairbanks and the police officers involved in the original investigation. They argued that the settlement couldn't waive their constitutional right to seek redress for civil rights violations. This legal battle continues, with courts divided on whether the settlement agreement prevents them from seeking damages. The true perpetrators of John Hartman's murder have never been officially held accountable. Jason Wallace, implicated by William Holmes, remains in prison for the separate murder he committed in 2002. Holmes continues to serve his double life sentence in California. The other individuals Holmes named in his confession have not been charged in connection with Hartman's death. The case remains a painful chapter in Fairbanks' history, a reminder of how justice can go terribly wrong. For 18 years, 4 young men lost their freedom while the actual killers remained at large, potentially committing other violent crimes. The Fairbanks Four case stands as a stark example of the human cost when the criminal justice system fails. The settlement agreement that secured the Fairbanks Four's freedom was controversial from the start. The document stated that the men agreed not to sue the state, the city of Fairbanks, or any of the individuals involved in their arrests and prosecutions. In exchange, the state agreed to vacate their convictions and dismiss the indictments against them without prejudice, meaning technically the charges could be refiled, though this was understood to be highly unlikely. Critics argued that this arrangement allowed the state to avoid accountability while still effectively acknowledging that the convictions couldn't stand up to scrutiny. The state maintained that the agreement wasn't an admission of wrongdoing, but rather a pragmatic resolution to a complex case. The Fairbanks Four and their supporters viewed the settlement with mixed emotions. Freedom was the primary goal, but the idea that they couldn't seek compensation for nearly 2 decades of wrongful imprisonment struck many as deeply unjust. Nevertheless, after 18 years behind bars, the prospect of immediate release was too compelling to reject. On December 17, 2015, when the 4 men walked out of the courthouse as free men, they were greeted by hundreds of supporters. Many were Alaska Natives who had followed the case for years, convinced that racial bias had played a role in the original convictions. The crowd erupted in cheers, drumming, and traditional songs. It was a powerful moment of celebration, tinged with the recognition of all that had been lost. Marvin Roberts, who had been released on parole in June 2015, just months before the settlement, spoke to the crowd. "I'm feeling great. I'm feeling vindicated. It's been a long battle." Eugene Vent, who had spent more than half his life in prison, simply said, "I'm overwhelmed. I don't know what to say." The men's re-entry into society was challenging in ways both expected and unexpected. They had gone to prison as teenagers and young adults in the late 1990s and emerged into a world transformed by technological advances, social changes, and personal losses. Family members had died, children had grown up without them, and the skills needed to navigate modern society were entirely different from what they had known before. Kevin Pease described the experience of re-entry. Everything from using a cell phone to finding a job to just walking down the street. It all feels foreign. You're trying to catch up on 18 years of life all at once. The men relied heavily on family, friends, and supporters who helped them navigate housing, employment, education, and the countless practical challenges of rebuilding their lives. Despite the settlement's prohibition on lawsuits against the state and city, the Fairbanks Four and their legal team believed they still had grounds for a federal civil rights case. In December 2017, exactly 2 years after their release, they filed a lawsuit in federal court alleging that their civil rights had been violated by the police investigation that led to their wrongful convictions. The lawsuit named the city of Fairbanks and several police officers as defendants and sought compensatory and punitive damages. The legal theory behind the suit was that the settlement agreement couldn't waive their constitutional right to seek redress for civil rights violations, a fundamental right that predated and superseded the agreement they had signed. The city and the named officers moved to dismiss the case, arguing that the settlement agreement explicitly barred such lawsuits. In October 2018, U.S. District Court Judge H. Russell Holland ruled in favor of the defendants, dismissing the lawsuit on the grounds that the men had unambiguously agreed not to sue as a condition of their release. The Fairbanks Four appealed this decision to the Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Their appeal argued that the release dismissal agreement was invalid because it was coercive. The men had to choose between freedom with no compensation or continuing to fight for justice from behind bars. They also argued that such agreements violate public policy when they shield officials from accountability for civil rights violations. In a significant victory, the Ninth Circuit reversed the lower court's dismissal in January 2020. The three-judge panel ruled that the men should have the opportunity to prove their claim that the release dismissal agreement was invalid because it was the product of police misconduct. The case was sent back to the district court for further proceedings. Judge Kenneth Kaiser, writing for the panel, stated, "The release dismissal agreement here raises real concerns that it undermines the public interest by erasing the civil liability of government officials allegedly engaged in misconduct without a mutually agreed settlement or any admission of wrongdoing. This ruling didn't guarantee that the Fairbanks Four would ultimately prevail in their civil rights case, but it did allow them to continue pursuing justice and potential compensation. The litigation continues to this day, moving through the federal court system at a deliberate pace. Meanwhile, the question of who really killed John Hartman remains officially unresolved. The confessions of William Holmes and Jason Wallace have never led to charges against them for Hartman's murder. Holmes continues to serve his double life sentence in California for an unrelated double homicide, while Wallace remains in prison in Alaska for the 2002 murder of Tiaka Bakote. The case took another turn in 2017 when the Alaska Department of Law announced it would not pursue charges against Holmes, Wallace, or the others implicated in Holmes's confession. Then Attorney General Jana Lindemuth stated that after a thorough review, prosecutors had determined there was insufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these individuals were responsible for Hartman's death. This decision frustrated many, including the Fairbanks Four and their supporters, who saw it as further evidence of a justice system unwilling to fully acknowledge and correct its mistakes. If the state accepted that the Fairbanks Four were innocent enough to release them, critics argued, then logically it should pursue charges against those who actually committed the crime. The lack of prosecution of the alternative suspects has left the case in a troubling limbo. The originally convicted men have been released, but no one has been held accountable for John Hartman's murder. For Hartman's family, this has meant a painful lack of closure and justice. Hartman's mother, Shirley Demientieff, who had initially believed in the guilt of the Fairbanks Four, came to question the convictions as new evidence emerged. Before her death in 2008, she had expressed doubts about whether the right people had been imprisoned for her son's murder. Other family members have continued to grapple with the complexities of the case and the emotional toll of never having a definitive legal resolution. The impact of the case extends far beyond the individuals directly involved. It has become a powerful symbol of the challenges faced by Alaska Natives and other Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. Alaska Natives make up about 15% of Alaska's population, but represent a disproportionate percentage of the state's prison population, roughly 37% according to some studies. The case has prompted discussions about racial bias in policing and prosecution, the reliability of confession evidence, and the challenges of securing justice in a system that can be reluctant to admit and correct its errors. It has also highlighted the power imbalance inherent in release dismissal agreements, where individuals may feel compelled to give up their right to seek compensation in exchange for their freedom. For the Alaska Innocence Project, which played a crucial role in securing the men's release, the case represented both a significant victory and a reminder of how difficult it can be to overturn wrongful convictions. Bill Oberle, who founded the Alaska Innocence Project and worked on the Fairbanks Four case for years, has pointed out that without the confessions from Holmes and Wallace, the men might still be in prison today, despite the lack of physical evidence connecting them to the crime. The four men themselves have taken different paths since their release. Marvin Roberts, who had been paroled shortly before the settlement, has been particularly vocal about criminal justice reform. He has spoken at universities and community events about his experience and the need for systemic changes. Roberts has also pursued his education and worked to rebuild relationships with family members, including his son, who was just a baby when Roberts was imprisoned. Eugene Vent, who was the youngest of the four when arrested at age 17, has struggled the most with reintegration. Having spent his entire adult life in prison, he faced significant challenges in adjusting to life outside. He has spoken about the psychological impact of his wrongful incarceration and the difficulty of forming relationships after so many years of isolation. George Fries has maintained a lower public profile since his release, focusing on rebuilding his life privately. Kevin Pease has similarly sought to move forward, though all four men remain connected by their shared experience and ongoing legal battle for compensation. The case has also prompted some reforms in Alaska's criminal justice system. In 2016, the state implemented new requirements for recording police interrogations in their entirety, a practice that might have prevented some of the issues in the Fairbanks Four case. There have also been efforts to improve cultural competency training for law enforcement officers working in communities with significant Alaska Native populations. However, advocates argue that much more needs to be done. Alaska remains one of the few states without a compensation statute for wrongfully convicted individuals. This means that even if exonerated, those who have been wrongfully imprisoned have no statutory right to compensation for the years lost. They must instead pursue civil lawsuits, which can be lengthy, expensive, and, as the Fairbanks Four have discovered, complicated by release agreements. The case has also raised questions about prosecutorial accountability. None of the prosecutors involved in the original cases have faced professional consequences for what many now view as a serious miscarriage of justice. The police officers who conducted the problematic interrogations have similarly avoided any official repercussions, though some have been named in the ongoing civil rights lawsuit. In 2019, the University of Alaska Fairbanks hosted a major conference on the case, bringing together legal experts, advocates, and community members to discuss its implications. The conference examined the factors that contributed to the wrongful convictions, including questionable interrogation techniques, reliance on jailhouse informants, and potential racial bias. One of the key speakers was Dr. Richard Leo, the false confessions expert who had testified during the 2015 hearings. Dr. Leo explained how standard interrogation techniques can lead innocent people to confess to crimes they didn't commit, particularly when the subjects are young, intellectually vulnerable, or in a compromised mental state, all factors present in the Fairbanks Four case. The conference also addressed the broader context of Alaska's criminal justice system and its impact on Alaska Native communities. Speakers noted that the Fairbanks Four case, while extreme in its consequences, reflected patterns seen throughout the system, from disproportionate arrest rates to harsher sentencing for Alaska Natives compared to non-Native defendants charged with similar crimes. For the community of Fairbanks, the case continues to be a source of division and reflection. Some residents remain convinced of the original defendant's guilt, pointing to the confessions and witness statements. Others see the case as a clear example of a rush to judgment that resulted in a profound injustice. Many acknowledge the complexity of the case and the difficulty of establishing absolute truth after so many years. Local media coverage has evolved over time. The Fairbanks Daily News Miner, which initially reported the case largely from the prosecution's perspective, later published extensive coverage of the new evidence and the questions surrounding the original convictions. The paper's editorial board eventually called for a thorough re-examination of the case, reflecting a broader shift in community sentiment. The Alaska Innocence Project continues to cite the Fairbanks Four case in its advocacy for reforms that would prevent similar miscarriages of justice. These include mandatory recording of all police interrogations, stricter standards for the use of jailhouse informant testimony, and the establishment of a state compensation statute for the wrongfully convicted. The case has also inspired artistic responses. In 2018, a documentary titled The Fairbanks Four premiered at the Anchorage International Film Festival, chronicling the men's fight for freedom and the community activism that supported them. Theatre productions, poetry, and music have also emerged from the Alaska Native community, using art to process the trauma and injustice represented by the case. For John Hartman's family, the lack of a definitive resolution continues to be painful. While some family members have come to believe in the innocence of the Fairbanks Four, others maintain that justice was served by the original convictions. All agree, however, that John's memory has sometimes been lost in the controversy surrounding the case. John Hartman was just 15 when his life was cut short. Friends and teachers described him as a quiet, kind teenager who enjoyed fishing and hoped to become a pilot. His violent death shocked the community not just because of its brutality, but because it seemed so senseless. A young boy beaten to death while walking home. In the years since the Fairbanks Four were released, there have been occasional calls for the case to be reopened with the goal of definitively identifying and prosecuting Hartman's killers. However, without new evidence beyond the Holmes and Wallace confessions, which the state has deemed insufficient for prosecution, such efforts have not gained significant traction. The statute of limitations for most crimes associated with the murder has expired, but there is no statute of limitations for murder itself in Alaska. This means that theoretically, if new evidence emerged, charges could still be brought against whoever killed John Hartman, even more than 25 years after his death. Some legal experts have suggested that the most likely path to a full resolution would be for someone with direct knowledge of the crime, perhaps one of the other individuals Holmes implicated, to come forward with corroborating information. Without such a development, the case may remain in its current state of limbo, with the original convictions vacated, but no one held legally responsible for the murder. The legacy of the Fairbanks Four case extends beyond Alaska. It has been cited in legal scholarship on wrongful convictions, false confessions, and the unique challenges faced by Indigenous defendants in the American justice system. Law schools now use it as a case study in how multiple factors, questionable interrogation techniques, reliance on jailhouse informants, potential racial bias, and tunnel vision in investigations can combine to produce a wrongful conviction. The case also highlights the limitations of our current mechanisms for addressing wrongful convictions. Even with substantial new evidence pointing to their innocence, it took the Fairbanks Four nearly 2 decades to secure their freedom. And even then, they were forced to choose between immediate release and the right to seek compensation, a choice no wrongfully convicted person should have to make. As their civil case continues through the federal courts, the Fairbanks Four remain symbols of both injustice and resilience. Their story demonstrates how easily the criminal justice system can go wrong, particularly when dealing with young, vulnerable defendants from marginalized communities. But it also shows the power of persistent advocacy and the possibility of eventually securing some measure of justice, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. For the community of Fairbanks and for Alaska as a whole, the case represents an ongoing reckoning with difficult questions about justice, race, and accountability. It has forced a conversation about who is valued in the system, whose stories are believed, and what happens when the system makes a mistake. The true measure of that reckoning will be whether it leads to meaningful reforms that prevent similar injustices in the future, reforms that ensure interrogations are conducted properly and recorded fully, that jailhouse informant testimony is thoroughly vetted, that investigations consider all possible suspects rather than focusing on the most convenient theory, and that those who are wrongfully convicted receive appropriate compensation for the years stolen from them. Until such reforms are fully implemented, cases like that of the Fairbanks Four remain not just historical injustices, but warnings about flaws in a system that continues to operate today. The men themselves, now in their 40s, continue to rebuild lives that were interrupted in their youth, carrying both the scars of their experience and the determination to ensure that their suffering leads to positive change. As Marvin Roberts said in a 2020 interview, "What happened to us shouldn't happen to anyone, but since it did happen, we have a responsibility to make sure it means something. Every day of freedom is precious to me, but true freedom will come when we know that what happened to us can't happen to someone else's son or brother or father." The story of the Fairbanks Four is not over. Their civil case continues, as does their advocacy for justice system reforms. The full truth about who killed John Hartman may never be officially established, but the case has already changed Alaska's legal landscape and raised critical awareness about the factors that contribute to wrongful convictions. In that sense, though justice has been delayed and remains incomplete, the long fight of the Fairbanks Four has not been in vain.